Hey everybody, it's Krista. This is Bad at Keeping Secrets. I'm here with Eirinie Carson. She just actually, when was the publishing date? Was it a couple weeks ago?
Yesterday. It was
Yesterday?
yesterday.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are here celebrating The Dead Are Gods, your new memoir, which is beautiful. It's been compared to Joan Didion's A Year of Magical Thinking, which I feel like was one of my favorites. That I read many, many years ago. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. You're a British writer. Do you identify as British?
Yeah, I do. Very
Um,
much so.
writer living in Petaluma, California. And you've kind of had a rock and roll lifestyle. You were a model for many years. And this is a book about the loss of someone incredibly dear to you. And kind of how I think the words that you use, moving through grief, and sort of all of the feelings and things that come up around the sudden loss of someone you deeply care about. I think right now it's really, I think all of us can sort of are going through some sort of grieving process. And so I think that this is a really,
Mm.
um, I don't know, comforting companion to understanding all of the different ways that grief manifests itself, and sort of stays with you and holds on to you, whether you have a choice or not. So I start all of these interviews a little bit about going back in time to kind of your early exposures, how you got into writing and interested in the things that you were, and the other people around your life, if you grew up with writers or if you grew up in a like family of dentists or you.
Yeah, I started writing quite young. I was like very into Jane Austen. I was big into plagiarism initially in my early career. Um, and yeah, I started off just I wrote a lot, and I'm a college dropout, and so for me it felt I never called myself a writer or anything like that, because that seemed like something that um big time degree having people can call themselves, but not people who couldn't make the cut of an English lit degree. So yeah, I felt like a bit of a phony. Um, and actually, Mother magazine and my writing experience there was like maybe the first time that I ever was like, oh, look at me. Maybe I can do this, and maybe people care, and maybe people will read what I write. Um, so yeah, it's been a long time coming. My mum loves to talk about this book that I wrote when I was 11 or 10, called Relative Blunders. And it was like very Jane Austen, um, a heady, strong-willed heroine in the lead, and very chaste love triangles. Um, yeah, and that was initially named Family Mistakes, but I had received a thesaurus that year for Christmas, and so I just was like, let's make this a little fancier. And so Relative Blunders is really my first book.
There's a lot of different directions I feel like I could go, but I wonder if we could unpack the use of or how what you mean when you use the term plagiarizing. In that I feel like I could take this in a lot of directions, but I feel like it has all these connotations of you are never meant to plagiarize. But I feel like throughout history, a lot of like great art and artists and writers, part of the training was using other people's work and really examining it. And I guess I'm just curious, since it's kind of a loaded, dramatic word, what you mean by it.
um, I mean, I was really lifting plots from Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. So, but I also I hear you. I mean, the way that she wrote was inspirational to me, and I don't think I write like Jane Austen now. I mean, maybe one day, maybe the next book, but yeah, I don't. I mean, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? I mean, it's the same with music. It's kind of all being riffed on.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way. What drew you to Jane Austen?
My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was just the most special person, her name was Anne. She really loved Jane Austen and had a lot of Jane Austen books around. Um, So that was like a shared love of ours. So I
For,
think that.
for me, it was my grandmother too, who was
Was it really?
really a lover of
Classic.
Jane Austen. And I think that for me, what I've thought a lot about like why I was drawn to her. And I think because of my upbringing, there are some ways they're like Cinderella stories. And I think that I really enjoyed the idea of having to do no effort and then being somehow saved. And
Yeah,
be
sure.
early and oneself. And now like I rewatch like the A&E version of Pride and Prejudice, the like 8-hour version of it. And I'm like,
Yes. Adore. Wait, with who was in that? Colin Firth?
yeah, yeah.
Love that. Oh, no, sorry, I
Um,
don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but I love that version of Pride and Prejudice.
I think it's the best. I think it's the
I
best.
I agree.
But I think about like why does Colin Firth fall in love with um Elizabeth Bennet? Like she's kind of like mean to him.
Yeah, but what a refreshing treat after all of these like very demure, pale women who just talk about the weather, you know? Maybe it's kind of nice to have someone be a bit mean.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I just feel like what I know of like or what I understand of my human side, I like people who are nice to me. I'm like attracted to
Yeah.
this, but that doesn't get at, you're right. I should think about it more so like it's refreshing that she's honest and real in a way
Yeah.
that other people maybe aren't so much.
Yeah.
Um
I like nice people too. I'm not
I
looking for an Elizabeth Bennet right now in my life. I'm good.
know. So maybe let's kind of talk a little bit about how, again, we're talking about grief today and how it shows up for us in our lives. And I'm not saying that I think we all are going through something. It's really difficult to kind of just not be going through anything or not experienced it and yet still be human. But can you kind of talk a little bit about the beginnings of your relationship with your friend Larissa, who is so much more than a friend, a soulmate, a companion, a sort of extension of yourself? How did you meet? And can you kind of talk about how you became so close?
Yeah. We met at our friend Candy's Sweet 16. I was there because I was in love. There was a band playing and I was in love with the drummer, which is hilarious because I'm now married to a drummer. But he told me recently that he didn't feel the same way. And so I went like purely to just like ogle him. Um, and he was kind of like Pharrell Williams vibe, but 17. Very, very hot. Um, anyway, I was there to ogle him and like hold my broken heart and be like forlorn. And I met Larissa and she just kind of derailed the night. Like she's all I remember. I kind of quickly forgot about him. And yeah, we were like kind of in each other's orbit, went to the same clubs as underage teens and knew the same sort of people and like kind of circled each other a couple times before we were like locked in. And then that was it. She was a really particular person and it was really easy to she was a person who once she decided she didn't like you, that was you were done. And I found a way to be evergreen despite her like predilection for cutting people loose.
I feel like that must have made you feel the specialness of being chosen when all others or when the sort of bar is so high. And it's also when you talk about that, it's sort of what did it feel from me when I was reading The Dead Are Gods, there was a magnetism to her, a specialness to her as well, that you felt like just by nature of being her friend, you were in the in crowd. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the proximity, being in her presence, and how she was able to sort of give you, in some ways, it's almost like superpowers or something supernatural happens to you?
Yeah, I mean, she was like, there's no better word. So sorry, not my emails. There's no better word than she was just really cool. She was very cool. And I felt cooler in her proximity for sure. And also felt like I cannot believe this person thinks that I'm interesting enough, which maybe speaks to my self-effacing nature more than anything else. But yeah, she was like one of those people who, she was incredibly beautiful. She was tall, and like very lithe, and kind of cat-like looking, like a dark-skinned black girl at the time when I met her. And she would like walk into a room and everyone just assumed she was a celebrity because she just carried herself in a way that was like, you couldn't stop staring at her. And she was very gorgeous, and she was also incredibly smart, and had this wild laugh that was quite jarring. I still have voice notes of her laugh on my phone. And yeah, she was really, she definitely had a magnetism, and, and could be a really social person, and she could also withdraw very suddenly and deeply, and could be quiet and introspective. Um, yeah,
In the
she was
book,
really cool.
something that comes up quite like peppered throughout the book is silences, and the way the things that aren't said in silences, and the things like you had the sort of relationship with her that you could sit in silence and be comfortable. Can you talk a little bit about how knowing her and also this event, how the role of silence?
Mm. Um, well, I think because of the kind of power she commanded in a room, often when she was silent, people would get weirded out by it or think it meant something about them. And I kind of understood the need to kind of give her space and room, um, and but still be there. Uh, and that eventually she would come to me, and the silence would end. And so I talk about this in the book also, but the silence that happens after someone dies, with her, it felt like, oh, I know this is familiar to me. I just have to wait, is what I felt at the time. And I think this book, maybe thinking about it right now in this moment, was like a, a way of waiting for her, you know. One of her ex-boyfriends, who is also was a really good friend of hers, Pierre, was talking about how he had a dream about her, and it was really vivid, and she came and they had like a closure moment, and it was really lovely. They were in a big train station and she was saying goodbye, and I was like, God damn it, I want that. Like, I want like a very clear farewell, visit me please. And she hasn't yet, but I feel like in writing this book, I was revisiting maybe.
Can you talk about the white butterflies?
Yeah. So funny. The day, well, not hilarious. The day that she died, I was sat outside of we were living in a house in LA at the time, and I was sat outside, and there was a white butterfly, and it was persistent. And I remember having the thought that she, maybe it was her, even though there's no way that she would choose to come back as something so like just too cliche, a white butterfly. But then I see them all the time, and I know there is this kind of madness in grief where you begin to um, give meaning to things that perhaps other people who are not currently grieving think have no meaning. So for me, the white butterflies, I still see them on walks and I think of her. Even if they're not her, it's nice to have a thing that
Reminds you.
brings you back to the memory. Yeah.
Did you find that so the going back to the madness and grief, or how do you feel like, I mean, is it purely the joy, delighting in the joy of her memory, the function of how we sort of make things as constant reminders of the people we long for?
Hmm. I'm so sorry. Will you rephrase that question for me?
Oh no, I think it wasn't phrased correctly at all. I guess I'm I'm curious because I think that grief transforms, or we have to kind of come up with ways to, not to use your words, get through it,
Mm.
or cope with it. And there is sort of this madness or fictionalized existence that we have to create to just be
Mm.
okay with continuing. And I was wondering if there were other ways that you found yourself kind of going against your logic or your way of understanding to create these sort of comforting moments for yourself just to get out of bed and exist.
Yeah, I mean, oh my God, I had so many uh I did a lot of kind of self-flagellating. Like, I would go through her emails and I would read everything, and I would go through our WhatsApp chat and listen to all of the voice notes, and kind of it was painful and I cried a whole lot. But it felt kind of good to be in pain a little bit. That was, thinking about it now, it's like, why would you do that? You're already sad. But um yeah, I kind of, if it felt nice to be in that pain. So that, a lot of talking out loud to myself and to her. Um, and I mean, I think the maddest thing I ever did was to write a fucking book about it. So that was definitely a big part of my grieving process, was writing The Dead Are Gods, which at the time I didn't know was going to be a book. It was just things I had to write. And eventually it became one.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the title?
Yeah, I had been thinking about title, and I was coming up with like these sort of like flippant little glib phrases that weren't really, I don't know, they were just too casual, not really giving it the gravitas I wanted it to have. And I thought of this phrase, the dead are gods, and I was writing what is the titular essay in the book. And so it kind of stuck with me, but I didn't want, when I think of gods plural, I think about ancient gods, Norse gods and Greek gods, and um, these kind of fallible deities, who are flawed creatures. And that's what I wanted. I didn't want her to be this untouchable person. I wanted to live in the muck of her life as well as the beauty.
No, I mean, it's exquisite. I think it's reflected also. There's like a supernatural power that Larissa is everywhere, like in a very also spiritual way. Like when you go to Paris, for example, you can feel her places, where I feel like there was that to me had a very sort of God or omnipotent or omnipotent feeling to it. And maybe it was just a projection on my part about what my understanding of a God or a power greater than oneself. But I also think that I love it in the context of the sort of ancient gods of these flawed creatures, feel still idyllic. Can you talk a little bit how, I think another thing that um, comes up is the idea of, because you're telling your story, but inevitably you're also telling her story by through you. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you went about choosing what to include and how to focus, because it's not necessarily tragic story or a glorious story, but it's beautiful and human and complex. And I think that there must have been a lot of thought behind what you wanted to include in the portrait you wanted to kind of make.
Thank you, first of all. That's really lovely to hear. Yeah, I was trying to move away, even in my eulogy to her, which is where the book first started. It was a eulogy I was going to read at her funeral, and it just spiraled out of control, and here we are. But even in that, I didn't want to do that thing that people do at funerals where they're like, and they were so great, and the end. Because you flatten someone's life that way, and sure, and that whole kind of idea of not speaking ill of the dead is cool, but also where is the life there if you smush them down to they were a good person or a good neighbor or a good daughter? How boring. And Larissa was wonderful because of all of her complexities. There's a chapter called I Don't Like You, and I wanted to list all of the ways that she could also be a shitty friend or kind of fail to meet what I needed as a friend. And I wanted to remember those things too, because that was part of the fabric of her. So yeah, I felt that was really important.
I think also I think for me as someone who really is trying to figure out why I'm inexplicably drawn to sadness or pain, or it's really comforting to me to look at people without, to try that to the best of my ability. I'm sure I'm not able to do this, look at people without judgment, and to find the sort of hard parts exciting and interesting and also really endearing. There's a moment I think I wanted to have you read on page 214 where you talk about I think it's in connection to secrets or not knowing. Would you mind reading a
Yes.
bit? So towards the end of the book, you're kind of grappling with what it is to save someone and how much you know and don't know, and sort of trying to tie up these sort of loose ends and make an offering to Larissa. And I was wondering if on page 214 you would read the paragraph that starts with, "If Larry had told me."
Okay. If Larry had told me back then that she was using, how would I have reacted? With compassion? With patience? Or would I have unleashed all of the shit upon her that I could never subject my father to? Would she have become a proxy for him? Would I have driven her back into the shadows? Now that the unthinkable has happened and my beautiful girl is dead, I have had the time to be angry and sad and shocked and devastated and finally understanding of her in a way I am not sure I would have been able to be if she had lived. Obviously not a trade-off I'm thrilled with, but it is a way to, at the end of a life, say to one I have loved most, I see you, I love you with it all, I understand, I forgive you, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for reading that. I think there's a lot in there that I think you're dealing with, this idea of unknowns. And I think it's a natural thing, or at least for me, a coping skill to pose the question, what if? Can you speak to the usefulness of that question? Because I think it's a lot throughout the book, asking these questions of what if I was different? What if I could save her?
I mean, yeah, it's a hard question to grapple with, and I think in the end we have to let it go off into the wind because it's a question that kind of distracts from what I think is important about grief, you know. I feel like to think about how I could have saved her and what I could have done differently is to stop thinking about the fullness of her. And yes, it is painful that she died, and yes, I wish she hadn't died the way that she had, but those things are also part of her life, and I also have to hold those. And death is inevitable, and holding on to these unanswerable questions is not useful for me in remembering her anymore.
I think there's also a theme in the book is forgiveness. And I was wondering, I think a lot of the time we think about using forgiveness as a tool, offering it just to someone else or to ourselves. And I was wondering thematically how that played out for you in your process of grieving.
Well, I think in order for me to forgive Larry, forgive myself, forgive my dad, I had to look at how she died, which was not something I was willing to tackle in my initial drafts of the book. And I found myself like unable to like finish writing. It just felt like I was stuck. And it wasn't until a friend was like, have you thought about writing about how she died? And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. And then I sat down and I wrote an essay about how she died. And I was like, oh, that's it. Like it unlocked the rest of the book. But I had to kind of feel that and acknowledge that and look at that in order to process it. I couldn't just pack it away in a box and not think about it, you know. So yeah, I think like forgiveness comes there.
I think that really echoes the sort of, I think when I was growing up, my notions of the proper ways of grieving was it was like six steps of like the grief process, and then you just sort of are done with it. And I think this book is an illustration of sort of the ebb and flow and how I think that you do a really beautiful job of looking at the hard parts and embracing them. And there's a section in the book, I think earlier on, where you talk about finding a therapist. And can you talk a little bit about the role of therapy and if how the process of finding a therapist and then showing up helped or changed how you thought about what the grieving process should look like?
Yeah, it was tricky finding the perfect person. I mean, I always say finding a good therapist is like finding an adult best friend. It's like, how do you do this? It's so difficult. There's so much to go through before you find the right one. But I was lucky that I found a really great therapist quite soon after Larissa died. And having someone to talk through her life and grapple with some of the similarities of how she died and how my father lived and those things, and why some things felt more painful for me than they may have for other people. Just contextualizing things was amazing. And I loved her, that therapist. She was great. I also have another one now who I also love, because really I'm grieving all over again with this book out in the world. My grieving process was so entrenched in my writing about her, and then it became a book, and then I sold the book, and then I published the book, and now it's in the world, and now I kind of have to sit by myself with my grief. I could still write about her if I want, but I I think it's time to like just sit still with her. I
I
think
think about
that's
how again you talk through the time, how time changes grief a lot throughout the book, and now having released it and having these conversations with people who these are really intense conversations with. I mean, we've met once in passing, but we haven't really, we don't have a long relationship. How are you able to kind of talk about, open up, or how does it make you feel to kind of again relive this? Or is there a sort of numbness to it that you have to be able to continue on talking about it?
There's definitely my therapist and I kind of staked out boundaries for me in talking about
That's
grief.
great.
And because when you write about grief, I have discovered a lot of people want to talk to you about their grief, and I feel very strongly that people's grief should be witnessed, and they should have people listen to them when they talk about their dead loved ones. And so there is a lot of holding space that I do that is incredibly draining, necessary, and I'm glad to do it, but draining. So I think I've completely moved away from the question now, but I think that that is something that is definitely coming up in the promotion of this book, even casually, even with interviewers from magazines. I'm like, we are talking about the people that they have lost, and we are in community with this grief, and that is a lot. So I am feeling quite deeply, and then just taking a lot of quiet time and remembering that there are some things that are just for me, and they don't have to be for public consumption, which is a lesson for everyone on social media, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very personal book, and I've put a lot out there that some people didn't know. And yeah, so
How
preserving my space is important.
How have the other people who are close to Larissa reacted, or have you felt a sort of kinship, a revised sort of comfort, or have things? I could imagine that would be really complex to talk with friends and to read the book with friends, both good and potentially difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's been lovely. It's been the two of my earliest readers were two of Larissa's other best friends. And that was really nerve-wracking waiting for them to read it. I was like, come on, have you read it yet? But that was that felt very real. They loved it, thank goodness. But I also think our grief was so fragmented because Larissa was in Paris, some of our friends were in London, I was in California. So when she died, there was this disconnect, and I felt very far away from her and the aftermath of her death. And so in a way, them reading this book felt like gathering us together in the same room, and like being in community together and holding our girl. So that's been really nice. Yeah.
I think thinking about the purpose of memory and how memories change throughout time, something I really loved stylistically, the way that you anchor each of the sections with emails or messages, exchanges from the two of you. I mean, they're very illustrative of a deep love and a closeness. Something that I think, how did you make the decision to actually put these sort of records in the book?
I have a dear friend who is also a writer, who's actually in this room currently, called Steph, and I had been sending her a lot of like what I had been writing. She was the first person who was like, hey, this is a book, by the way, everything that you've written. But I had also, there was one day where I was going through her emails, as I said, I loved to do. and I was just sending ones to Steph, like pages of them, and she suggested that I include them in the book, and then we kind of talked through how that would look, and hopefully each text or email speaks to a little bit of the chapter that it precludes. But yeah, that was why. And I also feel like it just fleshes Larry out in a real way. It's like all well and good for me to talk about her and remember her and tell you what she was like, but I have all these voice notes and I couldn't put those in, so this was the logical thing to put in. I wish I could put the voice notes in.
I wish we could have too. I think that there's something, I think you use the word cackle to describe her.
Yeah, she had a great laugh. Oh my gosh.
And I think like having these bits of her is extremely generous, and also it makes it real in a way that I think really adds to the weight of the grief. I guess you could say. There was one more last question I wanted to ask you, and it was about sort of the things that we withhold from each other, the sort of secrets, because I think that there's some questioning throughout the book on if, again, we talked about this not being necessarily the best direction for like aiding in grief, the what ifs, and sort of our delusions. And sometimes I think like breaking down the boundaries of if people felt less judged or by like society at whole, like what is the need for secrets? How do you know? Because there's also this sort of allure around them, but also they can be really deadly and dangerous. And I guess I need to formulate an actual question in that. But
no, I got it. I mean, it's a tough thing to know that you love someone, but also that maybe you don't know everything about them, because what an unhinged concept to know everything about someone that you love. And I think there has to be a settling, especially when someone dies, that there are some things that you will never know. And how do you reconcile that and live comfortably in that and stop fucking poring over everything to try and find the answer that you will never know. So I mean, there were a lot of secrets between Larry and I that I wasn't even aware of, and I had to look at them as best I could and know that some things are unknowable and some things are unknowable.
I love it. I mean, I hate it, but I
Yeah.
think there's this, I feel like we grew up thinking that we would know everything and there were obvious answers to things. And I think it's like a rude awakening for me as an adult that like actually I've spent my whole life looking for answers and and maybe there aren't any. And it's kind of a shattering to my understanding of the world and how how I've been wanted to exist.
Totally. People have interior life. Well, yeah, I mean, every rom-com we ever see is like, you know everything about someone when you love them, and that's how you love. You have to know everything. But I don't think that's necessary.
So this is a tangent that is a secret side note, but I really want to, maybe it's the wrong way to end this because we're so out of time, but it's a theme recently in my friends and my romantic partners for people to withhold information to keep things spicy or interesting. And it just dawned on me, like, but like that never, like I wouldn't want my partner to not share something with me in order to like preserve a certain amount of allure. And I don't think this is directly related to this, but like when I think about the things that I don't tell people and why I don't tell them, I have so many reasons, none of which are spicy reasons. But I think investigating the hard spots or the places what the whys is a really great, not great, but fruitful way of offering oneself some grace and acceptance in whatever feelings and emotions come up. I think I guess I really appreciated the exploration. I think the value of friendships and the completeness of your union, and then also the acknowledgement that relationships change over time, and that the closeness sort of flows and morphs into different realities, but it's still there, ever present.
Yeah.
I just think that this is a really beautiful love story, and understanding what it is to know another human. And thank you so much for it. Thank you for writing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for interviewing me. I'm so honored and a little starstruck. Yes.
Okay. Thanks again. I best of luck with the rest of the tour. I'll post the tour
Thank you.
For everybody too.
Awesome.